The NFL has adopted a new kickoff rule that will have a major impact on the Buffalo Bills. How so? I'm breaking that down for you today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, folks, welcome in. Very excited to dive into today's topic, which is the NFL Kickoff Rule, what's different, and how that will impact the Buffalo Bills from both a strategy perspective and a roster construction perspective. And this was an episode that was highly requested. I've been interacting with folks in the Locked On Bills subtext community, and so many people asked me to do an episode on the kickoff rule. And I've already done one back in March when everything was announced, which gave some thoughts on it. But since then, we've learned a lot. We've heard from NFL special teams coordinators. We've seen more data from the XFL, and it just positions us to have a better conversation about what this is all going to look like. So that is what we are doing today. I want to start by kind of getting into the rule change itself. Then I want to talk about what really happened with it in the XFL, and then we will apply everything to the Buffalo Bills in terms of roster construction and strategy. So as I've said a few times this offseason since the rule change was announced, this is the most significant rule change in my lifetime of watching the NFL. This is no small deal. This isn't a new penalty or something very small. This is a big deal. This is a notable shift. And this new rule comes after the NFL had the lowest kick return rate in the history of the league in 2023. And the NFL passed this new rule with 29 teams being in favor, 3 teams being against it. The 3 teams that were against it, the Green Bay Packers, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the San Francisco 49ers. We've heard from the Packers and 49ers as to why they voted against it, and I want to share their reasons with you, and then we'll talk about what the actual rule change is. So the Packers, their team president, Mark Murphy, had this to say as to why they voted against it. He said, quote, "Our issue was that it's such a major change. Our thought was it makes sense to have as a trial or experiment in the preseason to see there's going to be some unintended consequences, and I just felt like it made sense to have a trial." 49ers owner Jed York, this is what he said, quote, "The concern is that it's such a drastic change to a play. From a health and safety standpoint, we've tried to address the play. It was the most highest rated injury play that existed. So they're going from that to trying to reintroduce the play into the game and make it more of a real play as opposed to a ceremonial play. I'm 100% for that. I just want to make sure with something that's brand new that we have the opportunity to address it during the middle of the season." So Jed York just wanted some flexibility during the year to be able to make a change on the fly as opposed to after the season. So what is this new rule that has everybody buzzing? Well, first of all, let me say that I'm going to provide a link in today's show notes to an article that was released on Monday, July 15th from summersports.com. They put together an incredible piece that broke down everything regarding the new kickoff rule. I'm going to share a lot of that data in today's podcast. I thought the article did a really good job of really focusing in on blocking schemes and coverage schemes for the play. They also charted every XFL kickoff from 2023, which is over 400 kickoffs, and shared the results. And of course, there's a lot of carryover from the XFL kickoff rule to what is now in place in the NFL. So here is how that article summarized the new rule. And again, there's a link in today's show notes. The new kickoff will require the kicking team to have 10 players lined up with their lead foot on the receiving team's 40-yard line. The receiving team's setup zone will have at least 9 players and will require 7 of those players to have their lead foot on their own 35-yard line with alignment requirements based on the field's landmarks, which are the numbers and the hashes. 2 of the 9 players in the return team setup zone can be off the 35-yard line within a 5-yard range, but must remain outside the hash marks. The kickoff team and all return players in the setup zone cannot move until the ball is either caught or hits the ground. The returner or returners may move around freely before the ball is live. And the kicker cannot cross the 50-yard line until the ball hits the ground or a returner. So structurally, just very different in terms of how things are set up. And again, I'd encourage you to click on the link for this article, which is in today's show notes, that has video. It has diagrams that really explain all of this. So you can not only see diagrams, but actual plays from the XFL to get a true feel for what all this is going to look like. So that's the setup. On the other side of it, I want to talk about what happens once the ball is kicked, talk about what happened in terms of the XFL and what the data says, and then we'll get into the very specific Bills angle for this conversation, folks. So be sure to stick with me. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. Therapy is helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, so we talked about structurally what the play is going to look like. And again, please check out the article. There's great video, great diagrams. Now I want to talk about what happens kind of after the ball is kicked. And I think a lot of that starts with understanding the landing zone. The landing zone is from the receiving team's goal line to the 20-yard line. That's where the ball has to land. If a kick falls into the landing zone, the ball must be returned. There are no fair catches. That's a big deal. If it lands between the goal line and the 20-yard line, the ball must be returned. There is no such thing as a fair catch. A kick that lands short of the landing zone or is kicked out of bounds before the goal line will be placed on the receiving team's 40-yard line. So that's a big deal. If you don't get it in the landing zone and it lands short or it's kicked out of bounds before the goal line, the team gets the ball at the 40. A kick that hits the landing zone and then goes into the end zone must be returned or downed by the receiving team. If the ball is downed, it will be placed on the receiving team's 20-yard line. So if you receive the ball or you take the football and it goes into the end zone and you down the football, it goes to the 20. And so that's probably not a very attractive option for the receiving team. A ball kicked through the back of the end zone or one that bounces in the landing zone and through the back of the end zone will be placed on the receiving team's 30-yard line. A ball kicked in the end zone stays in bounds, returned or downed. If downed, then a touchback to the 30-yard line. So basically a traditional touchback where it's fielded in the end zone and downed, or it goes out of the back of the end zone. That goes to the 30, which is different than the thing that's before. That means that the ball rolled into the end zone and is downed, or you fielded it and downed it, right? It just goes to the 20. And then the last thing that I'll say here is that onside kicks are only allowed in the fourth quarter as declared by the trailing team. So you don't have to ever think about a surprise onside kick under these new rules. So that's the setup, that's the consequences, that's the rules, right? So what happened in the XFL? Because so a lot of this parallels what the XFL has been using. There are some differences. I think the three biggest differences between the XFL and the NFL is, first of all, in the XFL, the ball was kicked from the kicking team's 30. It will be the 35 in the NFL. Kicks short of the landing zone or out of bounds in the XFL, the ball goes to the 45. For the NFL, that's the 40. And touchbacks went to the 35 in the XFL, the 30 in the NFL. And I think that's the most fascinating to me, is that difference right there. Because there's a part of me that just wonders if teams are just going to eventually just say, hey, we're doing touchbacks. We're not dealing with this. We don't like the variance that this play introduces. We have a hard time stopping it, and we're just going to give you the 30-yard line. More on that to come, but that's one of my initial suspicions about all of this, if things do become tricky for the coverage teams. Some other important data as it relates to the XFL. 97% of kickoffs were returned. 97%. Under the previous NFL kickoff rules last season, that was only 22%. So you're going to see a significant shift in the amount of kicks that are returned. I don't think you're going to see teams downing the ball, and I'm not entirely sure you're going to see kicking teams just give touchbacks and concede the 30-yard line. The average yard line that the ball was fielded at last season in the XFL was the 7.7 yard line. So that landing zone is the goal line to the 20, and the average spot that the ball landed was about the 7.5 yard line. Yards per return last season in the XFL, they averaged 20.8 yards per return, and that makes the average starting field position the 30. I also thought this was fascinating. There was only one kickoff return for a touchdown in the XFL last season. And I think that's one of our big suspicions, is that, well, are you just going to see games significantly impacted because you're going to see a lot of return touchdowns? That wasn't the case in the XFL. They only had one all season, and 97% of their kicks were returned. In the NFL last season, 22% of the kicks were returned, and there was 4 kick return touchdowns. So from a volume perspective, the NFL actually had more kick return touchdowns, although the average starting field position in the XFL was further than the NFL. And of course, that's a big deal, right? Your chances of scoring go up the better your starting field position is, right? That's pretty obvious, but there's obviously also data that tells you that. So these might feel like minor differences, but these are the types of margins that I think are really significant to understand, because I think it is going to have an impact. I think teams are going to, obviously there's a big adjustment. I think that's where you start. There's a huge adjustment to how teams are going to kick off the ball, how teams are going to return it, what challenges they have along the way, and then figuring it out on the fly. It's not like you're going to have an off season to figure this out. Nobody's ever done this at the NFL level, so it's going to happen, and every week you're trying to adjust. And so I think it's going to have a significant impact. Will there be lots of kick return touchdowns? Well, there weren't in the XFL, but this could be different. You know, there's some minor differences in the rules, and perhaps it leads to more explosive returns in the NFL. But it's probably going to impact scoring. I'd be willing to bet that I think this will be a season where scoring is up. And actually last year it was down a little bit, but I think it'll go up this year, and it could be one of the highest scoring seasons in NFL history just based on teams having better field position, and it's easier to score when you have less distance to go to score, right? That's just how that goes. So hopefully that positions you well to understand the rules, what the rules led to in the XFL, some of those differences. On the other side of it's probably the most important part of this specific conversation, because I'm going to get into the specifics for the Bills, the decisions that they have to make in terms of the kicker, the returner, the coverage schemes, the blocking schemes, what that means for roster decisions. So all of that is coming up here for you on the other side of it. So be sure to stick with me. Folks, there's nothing quite like being at the ballpark, taking in a Major League Baseball game during the summer. If you want to do that, you got to download the Game Time app. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets, and they have everything, all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. You can get tickets on the Game Time app. So snag the tickets without the stress. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So let's apply all of this to the Buffalo Bills. The first thing that I want to acknowledge here is that I believe that these kick returns are going to look a lot more like run plays. It's not as much of an open field play anymore. It's going to look a lot more like a run play. And I think that impacts the types of returners we're going to see having those opportunities to do kick returns. I think it's going to be more running backs where you want vision, you want contact balance. I think those are your primary traits. Of course, you want speed. Speed is always going to matter, but I think there has to be instincts and vision with that speed. There's not as much air in the play. It's not as much of an open field play. So with it being more condensed, I think that puts more of an onus on vision and contact balance. And I think the differences between a kick returner and a punt returner were always pretty significant in the NFL. I think the variance between them is even more drastic under these new rules. So who do I expect to be the guys for the Buffalo Bills that get these opportunities to return kicks? Two names really pop for me: Ty Johnson and Curtis Samuel. Ty Johnson, really kind of the ultimate player for this, because of course he is a running back that has low 4.4 speed. So running back skill in terms of vision and contact balance and feel with the ball in his hands in terms of being able to navigate tighter, condensed areas. But then he also does have a speed element, because I think you are going to want to be able to break pursuit angles. You're going to want to be able to corner and win the edge. And I think speed does matter there. Not quite as much as vision and contact balance. So I think Ty Johnson is kind of your ultimate player for the Buffalo Bills to do this. I think another guy that you'll see involved is Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel, our wide receiver, let's make no mistake about it, but a guy that does have running back skill. In terms of his utilization at Ohio State, just a lot of running back and receiver opportunities. In the NFL, that's obviously been way more receiver, but still some opportunities to carry the football. And I think in the context of these kick returns, I think he's a great option. And he certainly gives you, even more speed than Ty Johnson. He's got low 4.3 speed. So that is attractive. I think those are your two primary guys, where when you think punt returns, I'm thinking more about Daquan Hardy. I'm thinking more about Khalil Shakir to handle those duties. I think it's Ty Johnson and Curtis Samuel. Those would be, to me, the two favorites to be the lead kickoff returners. Then there's the whole kicker conversation, and this is really, really, really fascinating. Obviously, you think, well, you got a kicker. They would handle the kickoffs, and that's probably going to be the case. I know of at least one team that I've been able to source. I won't tell you what team it is. I'll tell you that it's not the Bills. They are using their regular kicker to do the kickoffs. And the thought here is that you're going to see kickers' involvement increase when it comes to having to make tackles. And that's not a primary function of a kicker, right? You saw Tyler Bass try to tackle, was it Jalen Reagor for the Patriots last year? That wasn't a pretty sight. We'd like to see less of that, but the reality is it feels like kickers are going to be more involved. In terms of data, last year in the XFL, 4% of actual tackles were made by the kicker. And that's not a high percentage, but it is a chunk. But that's only actual tackles. That doesn't include missed tackles by the kicker. It doesn't include the influence of the kicker, right? Because I think the kicker is going to have an important job of leveraging the return, right? So they're kind of like the deep safety. And their job is to leverage, right? And as that deeper player, funnel the ball back towards where the help is. So while they're going to make some tackles and they're going to miss some tackles, there's a leveraging of the ball component that you have to equate into what's required of that position on this play. Dave Tube, who's one of the best special teams coaches in the entire NFL. He's the special teams coach for the Kansas City Chiefs. He offered the following quote on kickers' involvement with these new rules, keeping in mind they have Justin Reed. Justin Reed is a very good starting NFL safety that has a background of kicking. He's actually made field goals and done kickoffs in NFL games. Like, what an asset that player is under these circumstances. So this is what Dave Tube said. I like to have somebody who is able to make a tackle. Harrison Bucker, who's the Chiefs kicker, is able to make a tackle, but I really don't want him making tackles all year long. If you watch the XFL, and we watched every play, I bet kickers were involved in probably at least 25 to 40% of the tackles, either trying to make a guy bounce back or making the tackle itself or just missing the tackle. We don't want Bucker in that situation, but he will be the kicker. He'll be a guy we'll use in certain situations. He's got a lot of ability to move the ball, whereas the other guys may not be as adept at doing that, and we'll use him. So that's the piece of the kicker conversation. While hang time no longer matters, it's completely irrelevant. Placement of the ball matters, right? You're going to want to put the ball in certain spots that is advantageous for your coverage unit. But then there's the whole knuckle kick. This is an important thing. If you have a kicker that can do a knuckle kick, which is kind of like a ball that doesn't spin and just goes and bounces, because once it lands, everybody can move. And if you can get that ball, if you can get that returner to field the ball off the ground as opposed to catching it, it's going to elongate their ability to advance. And so that knuckle kick is big. And for as attractive as a guy like Justin Reed is to do this, he's not going to give you that. So he can make the tackle, but there's a trade-off. So while it's like, can you just get anybody to get the ball to land in the landing zone? Yeah, there's probably a large list on every team that can do it, but can they get the right spin on the ball, and can they directionally do it with consistency? And can you avoid the catastrophe, which is kicking the ball out of bounds and the other team gets the ball at the 40-yard line? So there's a lot to be mindful of. It's not just, well, he's going to have to make tackles. There's so many layers to it, and hopefully that unpacks all of it. So will Tyler Bass be doing the kickoffs? My guess is yes, but is there an element to this that lends itself to other people doing the kickoffs situationally when you want to have the tackler? Are there going to be situations where you want to have the English on the ball, right, to create a certain spin dynamic? All of that factors into it. The next question that I have about this is, and I kind of teased this in the other segments, is will there be touchbacks? And this is another quote here from Dave Tube that I think matters. He said, if we do a touchback out of the back of the end zone, now they're getting the ball at the 30 instead of the 25. So that 5 yards makes a big difference. That's another 3% chance you're giving the offense to score. And one of my favorite things about the Bills under the previous rule is that they didn't concede the 25-yard line. Sometimes they did, but for the most part, they wanted to force you to return the ball. And a lot of times the Bills were able to tackle teams well inside the 25, sometimes within the 20. And so now you're making them go further to score. Now, does that backfire? Sometimes, yeah, it does. And it hurts. It sucks when that happens. But for the most part, I think it was advantageous to the Bills. So I think the outcomes will dictate this, obviously, but there is a piece of me that is suspicious that teams are going to say, well, if the average field position is the 30 and we can achieve that without having to deal with the tackling element, yeah, we'll just kick the ball into the end zone and you can have the 30. I think every team will have a different approach, but based on the Bills' attitude towards the previous touchback opportunities, and now that it's further down the field, you feel like the Bills are definitely going to be a team that's not going to just kick the ball into the end zone, although situationally that could happen. And, as the outcomes happen, we'll see how that evolves. So that's a question that I have. Then there's the blocking schemes. And the alignment, you're kind of limited in terms of the alignment requirements, but there is different techniques that you can use. Obviously, there's trick plays that you can use with your two returners. You can do reverses. There's different blocking schemes. Like you can set up a trap play, right? Like have a couple guys block down and one guy block out and create a little trap play. You can have guys pull and create numbers advantages in certain situations if they're quick enough to get there. You can just do man blocking. You can do where everybody has, okay, I got this. Everybody just says, I got you, I got you, I got you. You do man blocking. You have certain drop blocking where you could take a couple of steps back and feel it out. And just the objective there would be, okay, we're going to drop back a little bit. And then, it's more like, okay, the first guy that we see approach a certain area of the field, that's going to be our guy, right? There's so many different ways to do it. I'm sure every team's going to have a different approach. And I think it's going to evolve a ton, but that's something to be mindful of. Then there's the coverage schemes, covering the kick. You can stunt, right? You can have guys cross. You can have spies where you might pull some guys that are on the line back. So you have a second level, right? So you have a first level that maybe takes on contact and a second level that is able to fill holes, kind of like a D-line linebacker relationship. So there's so many different options here with how you can block and how you can cover. But I think the interesting part of that is how it impacts roster construction. From the blocking perspective, the XFL, according to the article from Summer Sports, they said, look, some teams did try using offensive linemen to block, but they were not fast enough to execute the blocks in space. That's my concern as well, where it's not as much of an open field play and the air is taken out of it, you're still asking 300-pound dudes that are amazing athletes relative to their size. You're still asking them to connect with a moving target in space, which is very difficult to do. So I think that in theory, it sounds cool to use an offensive lineman, and the Bills do have a lot of athletic offensive linemen. The reality is those are going to be tough assignments. And I think maybe you'll see some of that, but I think for the most part, you won't see it. And if you do, I think it'll phase out. So I think from the blocking perspective, I think backup tight ends are going to be important. Bigger receivers, guys like Mack Hollins, Chase Claypool, those guys are going to be helpful to kind of stalk block and do what they typically do on a run play when they're playing offense. Linebackers, I think those are the types of players. Even some defensive ends would be helpful for the blocking. Now, when it comes to the coverage units, like I've talked about, this feels like it's going to be a run play. And so I think certain edge players are going to matter a ton. I think about guys like Kingsley Jonathan, Casey Toohill, and Javon Solomon for the Bills. Those guys are going to have an impact on these blocking and coverage units, particularly the coverage units, because now these guys are going to basically to be defending zone run plays and, attacking with certain leverage and being able to disengage and make a tackle in space. This is very much what they do. And then, of course, linebackers as well. I think we'll factor into this. I think that's why you saw the Bills and have seen the Bills add a lot to their linebacker depth. It's not just the attrition that they had last year and having to call A.J. Klein from a family vacation to play linebacker in the playoffs against the Kansas City Chiefs. I think it's not just hedging your depth from a traditional standpoint, but you're going to want these players for these coverage units because tackling in space, disengaging from blocks, winning in tight spaces, that's what linebackers do. It's very much like you're creating a box play here. So Deion Jones, Nicholas Morrow, Edefuan Ulofoshio as a draft pick, Dorian Williams, Balen Spector, these guys are going to be important for their role with this. I think tight ends and running backs are going to help you a ton in the blocking and covering of these kickoffs. And so I think where it really kind of hurts the guys on special teams is probably your wide receivers and some of your defensive backs. Now, if they have size, I think it will help them. Like I mentioned, Mack Hollins, Chase Claypool, those are attractive wide receivers. Andy Isabella, KJ Hamler, that's probably going to hurt players like that in their path to the roster because they're not, as a depth receiver, they're not going to have the same appeal blocking and tackling on these kickoffs. But then you think about from defensive backs, like maybe it doesn't help a Cam Lewis. This probably hurts a Cam Lewis, but maybe a Cole Bishop, a D Delaney, those types of players, they become more attractive under these new rules. So there's a lot. There's just a lot to consider with how this is different. What happened with the XFL, the kickers, the returners, the blocking, the covering. There's so much there, and it's going to have a material impact on not just the Bills, but the rest of the NFL. And I'm very fascinated to see how this does ultimately impact things. But this was my opportunity to kind of speculate and share how I think this is going to play out and what variables matter. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that this was the conversation that so many of you requested. And it's obviously, we're guessing right now, and it'll be fluid and it'll change a lot, but it's going to be a big conversation piece for us all season as this actually impacts the results of Buffalo Bills football games. So hopefully this positioned you to be ready for all of that. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. I certainly hope that you enjoyed. I hope that you come back. I hope that you will subscribe. It'd be awesome if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.